Consider for a moment the geography of power. In our own world, civilizations rise where rivers meet, where harbors provide protection, where mountains create natural fortresses. The placement of a capital city, the control of a mountain pass, the alliance between neighboring kingdoms, these determine who rules and who serves. Now, imagine this principle extended across an entire cosmos, not continents separated by oceans, but entire worlds suspended in the branches of a cosmic tree. This is where our journey begins. The Norse understood something profound about existence, that all things are connected, yet separate. That power flows not from isolation but from strategic position. Their cosmos was not a single realm but 9 worlds, each distinct, each essential, all bound together by a magnificent ash tree called Yggdrasil. This was not merely a creation myth, this was a sophisticated understanding of how systems maintain themselves, how civilizations endure, and how power once established must be constantly defended. Let us start where the gods themselves started, with violence and transformation. In the beginning, there was Ymir, a primordial giant of frost, emerging from the realm of ice called Niflheim, where it met the fires of Muspelheim. Neither good nor evil, simply existing the first conscious being in a void of potential. From his body came other giants, a race of enormous, chaotic entities. But here is what matters. Ymir represented raw, unorganized power, tremendous force without direction, without hierarchy, without control. The gods the Aesir saw this as a problem to be solved. Odin, together with his brothers Vili and Ve, made a choice that would echo through all subsequent ages. They killed Ymir, not in battle, not in self-defense, but deliberately, strategically. They recognized that the giants' continued existence posed a fundamental threat to any ordered cosmos they might build. This was elimination of a competing power source, the removal of an entity too powerful to coexist with their vision of how reality should function. But notice what comes next. Notice the transformation. From Ymir's body, the brothers created everything. His flesh became the earth beneath our feet. His blood became the oceans that cover our world. His bones formed mountains that touch the sky. His hair became trees. His skull, the dome of heaven itself, held aloft at 4 corners by dwarves. His brains scattered across the sky became clouds. Even his eyebrows found purpose, formed into a protective wall around Midgard, the realm that would one day hold humanity. This is creation through complete utilization. Nothing wasted. Every part of the defeated giant repurposed into the architecture of existence. It reveals something remarkable about the Norse understanding of power, that true dominance means not just defeating your opponent, but transforming their very essence into the foundation of your empire. The Aesir established their seat of power in Asgard, a realm positioned at the center of the cosmic order. Not geographically central, mind you, but strategically supreme. Asgard sat high among the branches of Yggdrasil, connected to other realms by a rainbow bridge called Bifrost. Imagine the defensive advantage this provided. A single bridge, guarded by the ever-watchful Heimdall, whose senses were so acute he could hear grass growing in Midgard. Any threat would have to cross this bridge. Any invasion would face this choke point. This was fortress thinking on a cosmic scale. From Asgard, the Aesir could project power outward while remaining secure. They built great halls, Odin's Valhalla, among them, where the honored dead would feast and fight and prepare. But Asgard was more than a military installation. It was a symbol. When the gods gathered in their golden halls, when they sat in council at the Well of Erd beneath Yggdrasil's roots, they demonstrated that order had replaced chaos, that intelligence had triumphed over mere force. Yet power requires more than position. It requires resources. This is where humanity enters the cosmic equation. The gods fashioned the first humans, Ask and Embla, from tree trunks found on a beach. Odin gave them breath and life. Vili granted them intelligence and movement. Vi provided senses and form. They placed these new beings in Midgard, that middle realm, protected by walls made from Ymir's eyebrows. One might think this was generosity. Perhaps it was. But consider what followed. Humans built temples. They offered sacrifices. They prayed, and their prayers rose like smoke to Asgard. They fought in the gods' names, died in their service, and the greatest warriors were chosen by Valkyries to join Odin's army in Valhalla. Humans, in their devotion and their struggles, provided something the gods needed: belief, worship, and most importantly, warriors for battles yet to come. This was not slavery. The Norse never saw it that way. This was reciprocity. The gods provided protection, victory in battle, favorable weather for crops. Humans provided honor, sacrifice, and military recruitment. It was a transaction, certainly, but also a relationship, the kind of bond that holds kingdoms together across generations. Now, let us turn our attention to Yggdrasil itself, the world tree. When you try to understand its scale, your mind resists. This was an ash tree whose roots delved into 3 separate realms. One reached into Asgard, where the Norns, those ancient beings who controlled fate, tended the well of Erd. They watered the tree daily with sacred water and mud, preserving its health. The second root extended into Jotunheim, realm of the giants, where Mimir's well offered wisdom at the cost of sacrifice. The third root descended into Niflheim, that primordial realm of ice and mist, where the dragon Nidhogg gnawed eternally at the root, trying to destroy the cosmic order. And the tree's branches? They held worlds. This was infrastructure in the truest sense. Not merely connection, but interdependence. When Yggdrasil trembled, all 9 realms felt the shaking. When its leaves withered, reality itself grew sick. The tree's health determined the stability of everything. It was supply line and communication network, support structure, and symbol of cosmic unity. A squirrel named Ratatosk ran up and down the trunk, carrying insults between the eagle perched in the highest branches and Nidhogg below. Even this detail reveals sophisticated understanding, that information flows through systems, that communication, even hostile communication, maintains connections between opposing forces. 4 stags wandered among the branches, eating the new growth. Their names were Dane, Dvalin, Dunir, and Durathor. They represented constant pressure, the eternal wearing away that all systems face. Maintenance was not optional. The Norns watered the roots. The gods watched over the tree, because they understood that infrastructure neglected eventually fails, bringing everything crashing down. The distribution of the 9 realms tells us much about the cosmic order the Aesir established. Asgard held the highest position, home of the warrior gods. Below it, in some accounts connected by Bifrost, lay Vanaheim, home of the Vanir gods, those deities of fertility and prosperity. We shall explore their importance shortly. Alfheim housed the Light Elves, beings of ethereal beauty. These 3 realms represented the divine and near-divine, the sources of order and cultivation. Then came the middle realms. Midgard, of course, where humans built their farms and ships and carried out their brief, bright lives. Beside it, Jotunheim, where giants dwelled in mountain halls and frost kingdoms. These 2 realms existed in constant tension: civilization and wilderness, human order and giant chaos, always in proximity, always in conflict. Below these lay the deeper realms, Svartalfheim, home to dwarves who crafted wonders in their underground forges. Nidavellir, in some accounts, was separate. In others, the same sources differ. But the principle remains. Skilled craftsmen, working in darkness to produce treasures and weapons the gods themselves required. Niflheim, that ancient realm of ice. Muspelheim, its opposite, realm of fire ruled by the giant Surtur. And Helheim, Hell's realm, the land of the dead. This vertical geography created hierarchy. Height represented proximity to divine power. Depth suggested distance from order, movement toward primal forces. But here is what makes it sophisticated. No realm was truly isolated. The tree connected all. Trade routes existed, dwarven weapons reached Asgard, human prayers rose from Midgard, giants occasionally crossed into other realms. This was not a static map, but a dynamic system where movement, exchange, and conflict constantly reshaped relationships. Yet even in the beginning, threats existed beyond the walls. In Jotunheim, the giants maintained their own territories, their own halls, their own power structures. They were Ymir's descendants, not all killed in that primordial slaughter, but scattered, surviving, remembering. Some giants possessed terrible wisdom. Others commanded elemental forces. They were not mindless monsters. They were an opposing civilization, one that preceded the gods' order and would outlast it. The relationship between Aesir and giants was complicated. Sometimes there was warfare. Thor particularly made his reputation smashing giant skulls with his hammer Mjolnir. But sometimes there were marriages, alliances, even friendships. Odin himself sought wisdom from the giant Mimir. Many gods took giant lovers or spouses. Blood mixed between the races. This was real politic on a cosmic scale. The gods knew they could not simply eliminate all giants. Too numerous, too powerful, too embedded in the structure of existence itself. So they built walls, maintained armies, created deterrents. They demonstrated strength while occasionally negotiating peace. They turned some giants into allies through marriage or treaty, while crushing others who posed direct threats. It was a delicate balance, and balance, as we know from our own world, is inherently unstable. The gods established councils. They met regularly at the Well of Urd, discussing matters of cosmic importance. This was governance, the daily work of maintaining civilization. Not every decision involved thunder and battle. Most concerned arbitration, judgment, the settling of disputes between parties. Thor might be famous for his giant slaying, but Tyr was the god of law and justice, willing to sacrifice his own hand to bind the wolf Fenrir when oaths alone proved insufficient. This tells us the Norse valued legal order, that they understood civilization requires rules binding even on gods themselves. Odin pursued knowledge with single-minded intensity. He sacrificed his eye to drink from Mimir's well, gaining wisdom. He hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, discovering the runes, those magical symbols that could alter reality itself. He wandered Midgard in disguise, learning from humans, testing heroes, gathering information. This was intelligence work. This was a ruler who understood that information determined outcomes, that knowing the future provided strategic advantage, that wisdom mattered as much as strength, for prophecy hung over everything. The Norns wove fate at the base of Yggdrasil, their threads determining the course of every life, god and human alike. Prophecies emerged from the Volva, the seeresses who could read the shape of time, and one prophecy dominated all others: Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the final battle when fire would consume the worlds, when giants and monsters would storm Asgard, when the Aesir themselves would fall. Imagine knowing your civilization's end date. Imagine having power over the present, but no ability to alter the ultimate future. How do you govern under such conditions? What choices do you make? The gods chose preparation. They chose to build armies, to forge weapons, to create alliances. They chose to make their time in power as glorious as possible, knowing it would end. This was not defeatism. This was a profound decision, that facing doom with courage and honor mattered more than desperate attempts to avoid it. The initial power structure, then, was this: gods at the center, humans below providing support, giants beyond the walls providing threat, and fate above all determining the arc of history. Infrastructure connected everything. Strategic positions provided advantage. Resources required constant attention. Threats necessitated eternal vigilance. It was, in many ways, not so different from the kingdoms of the people who told these stories. Viking kings faced similar challenges: maintaining centralized power, defending borders, managing resources, preparing for inevitable conflicts. The cosmos they imagined reflected the world they inhabited, scaled up to divine proportions. But this initial order, impressive as it was, contained vulnerabilities. Seeds of future conflict already existed in the foundations. Loki, the trickster, was blood brother to Odin, but loyal to no one. The giants remembered Ymir's murder and harbored ancient grudges. And not all gods were Aesir. There was another clan, another power center that would force the cosmic order to adapt or fracture. The war was coming, not with giants, but between gods themselves. And from that war would emerge both the height of divine power and the first cracks in an empire that believed itself eternal. There are moments in history when everything changes. When the established order faces a challenge it cannot simply crush, and must instead adapt. When power reveals itself to be not absolute, but conditional. The war between the Aesir and Vanir gods was such a moment, perhaps the first great conflict in the cosmos that ended not in annihilation, but in negotiation. Before we explore the war itself, we must understand who the Vanir were, and why their existence posed such a profound challenge to the order Odin and his kin had established. The Vanir gods dwelled in Vanaheim, a realm of their own creation, where the Aesir represented martial prowess, law, and dominion through strength. The Vanir embodied something equally powerful, but fundamentally different: fertility, prosperity, and the subtle magics that governed growth and abundance. They understood the turning of seasons, the ripening of grain, the spawning of fish, the birth of livestock. They knew how to make fields yield and how to make trade flourish. In a cosmos built on warfare, the Vanir controlled something more essential than weapons. They controlled sustenance itself. Their most prominent members were Njord, god of the sea and winds, master of maritime wealth, and his children, Freya and Freya. Freya governed the sunshine and rain, the conditions that determined whether humans starved or prospered. Freya possessed beauty beyond measure, but more importantly, she was mistress of Sidra, a form of magic that could see and shape the future, that could influence fate itself. Consider what this meant strategically. The Aesir had built their power on military might and hierarchical control. They could command, they could conquer, they could defend. But the Vanir possessed assets the Aesir could not replicate through force. The knowledge of how to make things grow, how to bring abundance, how to practice magic that the warrior gods considered beneath them. This was not a simple territorial dispute. This was a collision between different philosophies of power. The sources that survived, written down centuries after the fact by Christian scholars preserving pagan memories, do not tell us precisely how the war began. Perhaps it started with a dispute over worship, humans in Midgard honoring Vanir gods instead of Aesir. Perhaps it involved territory, resources, or a slight to honor that could not be ignored. The Norse understood that great wars often begin with small provocations, that a careless word or broken oath can unleash catastrophe. What we know is this: the war raged across realms, and neither side could achieve victory. Imagine the Aesir's frustration. Thor, mightiest of warriors, could smash giant skulls with ease. Odin, the Allfather, commanded wisdom and strategy. Tyr embodied martial law and courage in battle. They had defeated primordial chaos, had slain Ymir himself, had established cosmic order. Yet against the Vanir, these advantages proved insufficient. The Vanir fought differently. They did not meet shield walls with direct confrontation. They understood the long game, the patient application of pressure, the manipulation of conditions. When the Aesir attacked, they found crops withering, winds turning against them, prosperity draining from their victories. You can conquer territory, but what value is land that will not yield? Freya's cider magic proved particularly problematic. This was not simple combat sorcery. Cider involved trance states, the manipulation of fate's threads, the calling forth of knowledge about future events. It was shamanic, oracular, powerful in ways that direct force could not counter. A warrior can be brave against a sword, but how does one fight against magic that reshapes probability itself? The war ground on. Halls burned. Gods and goddesses on both sides suffered wounds. Resources were expended. And slowly, perhaps it took years, perhaps centuries. Time moves strangely in these accounts. Both sides came to a realization that would reshape the cosmic order. Total victory was impossible. But continued warfare would leave both pantheons weakened, vulnerable to the giants who watched from Jotunheim with keen interest. This is where the story becomes fascinating, because what happened next was unprecedented. Gods negotiated peace. The peace treaty between Aesir and Vanir represents the first recorded divine diplomacy. Not the imposition of terms by a victor upon the defeated, but a genuine negotiation between equals who had fought to exhaustion. Think about what this required. Gods who had been killing each other had to sit across from one another and find common ground. Had to admit that warfare had failed to settle the question of dominance. The terms they agreed upon were ingenious in their strategic sophistication. There would be an exchange of hostages, not prisoners, but honored guests who would live among their former enemies, whose presence would guarantee good behavior from both sides. The Vanir would send Njord, Freyja, and Freyja to Asgard. The Aesir would send Hoenir and Mimir to Vanaheim. This was mutual vulnerability as peace mechanism. If the Aesir betrayed the treaty, the Vanir could harm or kill Hoenir and Mimir. If the Vanir broke faith, their most powerful members would be at risk in Asgard. Each side held the other's loved ones as insurance against treachery. But notice something remarkable. This arrangement provided benefits beyond mere peacekeeping. By sending Freyja and Freyja to Asgard, the Vanir essentially exported their expertise. The Aesir suddenly gained access to fertility magic, to the knowledge of prosperity and growth, to agricultural wisdom they had never possessed. Their power base, previously dominated by military might, now diversified. They could offer their followers not just victory in battle, but abundant harvests and successful trade voyages. Freyja's arrival brought something even more valuable. She taught Sidra to the Aesir. Odin himself learned from her, despite the fact that this magic was traditionally practiced by women, and many considered it unmanly for a male god to pursue. But Odin cared nothing for such conventions. He understood that knowledge was power, that limiting yourself to martial arts meant limiting your strategic options. Imagine the shift in Asgard's culture. Warriors who had previously settled everything through strength now had access to subtle magic, to divination, to the manipulation of less obvious forces. The rigid hierarchy softened slightly, became more complex. Freyja was given a hall of her own folkvanga, and she claimed half of those who died in battle, her choice coming even before Odin's Valkyries made theirs. This was power sharing at the highest level. Freyja, meanwhile, brought blessings of peace and prosperity. He would later acquire a ship that could fold up to fit in a pocket yet could hold all the gods when needed, a symbol of adaptive capability, of resources that could expand or contract as situations required. He possessed a sword that could fight on its own, though he would eventually give it away for love, a decision that would have dire consequences during Ragnarok. But in these early days of peace, his presence transformed Asgard from a purely military installation into a more balanced civilization. The exchange benefited the Vanir as well, though the sources tell us less about their side of the arrangement. Hoenir was apparently tall and handsome, good at ceremonies, but perhaps not the sharpest mind among the Aesir. Mimir, however, was renowned for wisdom. His very head, after an unfortunate incident we shall address shortly, would become an oracle that Odin consulted before making crucial decisions. But here lies a problem inherent in hostage exchanges. What happens when the hostages are not of equal value? The Vanir discovered that Hoenir seemed incapable of making decisions without Mimir's advice. In councils, he would defer to Mimir constantly. The Vanir began to feel cheated. They had sent their best to Asgard and received in return one useful advisor and one handsome fool. Anger built. They felt the Aesir had negotiated in bad faith, had sent them inferior goods. Their response was brutal and telling. They beheaded Mimir and sent his head back to Odin. In most stories, this would reignite the war. A clear violation of the hostage arrangement, an act of violence that demanded retaliation. But Odin's response reveals the depth of the peace both sides desired. Instead of calling for vengeance, he preserved Mimir's head with herbs and magic. He sang spells over it until it could speak again, could continue to offer wisdom. He turned an act of violence into a permanent resource, a counselor who would advise him at critical moments. This was de-escalation as strategic genius. Odin absorbed the blow, transformed it, and maintained the peace. Because the peace was more valuable than pride, more useful than revenge. The treaty held. The two pantheons began to integrate. Intermarriage occurred. Freya would eventually love and wed Gerd, a giantess, further complicating the web of alliances. Freya's beauty attracted attention from giants and gods alike, creating diplomatic incidents that ranged from comic to dangerous. The boundaries between Aesir and Vanir blurred over time, until later peoples would barely distinguish between them, calling them all simply the gods. This integration created a more robust divine order. The combined pantheon possessed greater range of capabilities. They could wage war and ensure harvest, could fight giants and bless fertility, could practice both direct confrontation and subtle manipulation. It was strategic diversification, never putting all your power into a single basket, maintaining multiple avenues to influence the cosmos. Yet seeds of future instability had been planted. The Vanir gods in Asgard maintained their own values, their own loyalties, their own ways of seeing the world. When Freya desired something, she pursued it with a passion the more stoic Aesir found unsettling. Her famous necklace, Brisingamen, acquired by spending 4 nights with 4 dwarves who had crafted it, scandalized even in a pantheon not known for prudishness. The story suggests different moral frameworks coexisting in tension. Freya's later sacrifice of his magical sword for love would leave the gods vulnerable at Ragnarok. One could argue that a proper Aesir warrior would never have surrendered such a vital weapon. But Freya came from a tradition that valued love and growth as highly as battle prowess. His choice made perfect sense within Vanir values, even as it created strategic weakness. The peace treaty also established a precedent that negotiation was possible, that conflicts could be resolved without total war, that compromise could serve everyone's interests. This was sophisticated international relations playing out at cosmic scale. The gods had discovered something humans would rediscover repeatedly throughout history, that while war is sometimes necessary, peace is almost always more profitable. But there remained entities who had not been party to this peace, who watched from beyond the walls with their own ambitions and grievances. The giants in Jotunheim had observed the Aesir-Vanir war with satisfaction. Any conflict that weakened the gods served giant interests. When peace came, they had to recalculate. The combined pantheon represented a more formidable opponent than either clan alone. The balance of power had shifted against them. Yet the giants possessed patience. They had time. They remembered that prophecy spoke of an ending, of a day when fire would consume the worlds and the gods themselves would fall. They could wait. They could plan. They could occasionally test the gods' defenses, probing for weakness. And weakness existed despite the apparent strength of the consolidated divine order. Because there was one figure who belonged fully to neither camp, one being whose loyalties were always suspect, whose presence in Asgard represented a fundamental security risk. He was blood brother to Odin himself, bound by ancient oaths that could not be broken. His children would prove to be monsters. His machinations would eventually shatter the peace entirely. His name, of course, was Loki. The trickster god had been present throughout the Aesir's rise to power. He had helped build Asgard's walls, then sabotaged the builder, a giant in disguise, when the gods realized they might actually have to pay what they had promised. He had accompanied Thor on giant killing expeditions, sometimes helping, sometimes causing the very problems Thor had to solve. He was clever, charismatic, useful in ways that made the gods overlook his treacheries. But Loki had married the giantess Angbodr, and she bore him 3 children who would feature centrally in prophecies of doom: Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the serpent, and Hel, who would rule the dead. The integration of Aesir and Vanir had created a more powerful pantheon, certainly. It had ended a destructive war and allowed both clans to benefit from the other's strengths. It had demonstrated that gods could adapt, could grow beyond their original limitations, could choose diplomacy over endless conflict. But it had also created a more complex system with more points of potential failure, more relationships to manage, more competing values to balance, more individuals within the power structure who might, under the right circumstances, choose differently than the collective good required. The cosmos was more stable than before the war, but stability is not the same as security, and security, as the gods would learn, requires constant vigilance against threats both external and internal. The peace had been won. The pantheon had been consolidated. The golden age of divine power stretched out before them. But in the shadows, already, the instruments of their destruction were growing, and the gods' own choices, choices made with the best intentions, choices meant to neutralize threats, would instead ensure that when Ragnarok came, it would be swift, total, and absolutely inevitable. Every civilization faces enemies at its borders: the invading army, the rival kingdom, the barbarians beyond the walls. These threats are visible, comprehensible, manageable through military preparedness and strategic defense. But there is another kind of threat, one that walks among you, one that sits at your feasts and laughs at your jokes and knows all your secrets, one that you trust, even as it betrays you. The gods face such a threat in Loki, and their inability to properly assess and neutralize him represents perhaps their greatest strategic failure, a failure with consequences that would echo all the way to Ragnarok itself. Let us begin by understanding what Loki was, because the sources offer us contradictions that are themselves revealing. Loki was a giant by birth, son of Farbauti and Laufey. By blood, he belonged to the enemies of Asgard, to the chaotic forces the gods defined themselves against. Yet he became Odin's blood brother through ancient ritual, a bond so sacred it could not be broken. When Loki was present, Odin could not drink unless Loki also received a cup. This was obligation written into the fabric of existence itself, oath magic of the deepest kind. Why would Odin bind himself so completely to a giant? The stories suggest Loki's usefulness, his shape-shifting abilities, his cunning, his willingness to undertake tasks no proper god would consider. When the gods needed someone to seduce a giant's magical horse to prevent the completion of Asgard's walls, Loki transformed into a mare and did exactly that. The resulting offspring, an 8-legged foal named Sleipnir, became Odin's own mount, the swiftest steed in all the 9 realms. Loki retrieved treasures for the gods. When he foolishly caused Sif's golden hair to be shorn, it was Loki who ventured to the dwarves and returned with not only replacement hair, but also Gungnir, Odin's mighty spear, and Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. He solved problems, often problems he himself had created, but solved them nonetheless. This pattern repeated throughout the myths. Loki would cause disaster through thoughtlessness or malice, then fix it through cleverness, leaving the gods simultaneously angry and grateful. He was the agent of chaos who could be aimed sometimes at the gods' enemies, a useful asset, a calculated risk. Except the risk was never properly calculated, and usefulness blinded the gods to the fundamental security vulnerability Loki represented. For Loki had taken a wife from Jotunheim, Angrboda, whose name means she who brings grief. Together they had 3 children, and when the Norns wove prophecies around these offspring, the words were dark indeed. These children would bring destruction. They would stand against the gods at the final battle. They would be instruments of Ragnarok itself, Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the serpent, Hel the half-dead goddess. When the gods learned of the prophecy, they faced a choice, perhaps the most important choice they would ever make. And the decision they reached reveals something profound about the limitations of power, about the paradox of trying to prevent a predetermined future, and about how fear can transform potential allies into guaranteed enemies. They decided to neutralize the threat, to take these children from their parents and render them harmless. It began with deception. The gods summoned the children to Asgard, claiming they wished to meet Loki's offspring. The children came, perhaps curious, perhaps trusting, and the gods looked upon them and were afraid. The wolf Fenrir was already massive, already showing signs of the beast he would become. The serpent Jormungandr writhed with alarming size and strength. Hel was half beautiful and half corpse, her body divided by death itself, unsettling to beings who associated death with finality and defeat. Thor grabbed Jormungandr and hurled the serpent into the ocean surrounding Midgard, cast him out like refuse, into the cold depths far from the realms of gods and men. The serpent splashed down into those waters and immediately began to grow. Without limit, without end, feeding on fish and whales and whatever else the ocean provided. Over years and centuries, Jormungandr grew until he could encircle the entire world, until he could grasp his own tail in his jaws. The gods had removed him from Asgard, certainly, but they had created the world serpent, a monster of apocalyptic scale, nursing rage in the deep places and waiting. Consider what this meant strategically. The gods faced a threat they believed would grow dangerous, so they threw it into an environment where it could grow without limit. They removed it from their sight, and thus from their ability to monitor or influence its development. They transformed a young serpent into a creature so vast it would later rise from the oceans to drown the world. This was not threat neutralization. This was threat deferral with compound interest. Hel they banished to the underworld realm that would bear her name, Helheim, or simply Hel. She was given dominion over all who died of sickness or old age, all who did not fall in battle worthy of Valhalla. This seemed like containment. Send the death-touched girl to reign over death itself, keep her away from the living realms. But think about what this gave her. Control over every human who had ever died peacefully. Control over the countless souls that arrived daily from Midgard. An army of the dead, growing larger with every passing moment, loyal to their queen. The gods had given their enemy a resource base that dwarfed their own Einherjar warriors in Valhalla. They had made Hel into a power, a queen, someone with the means and motivation to stand against them. And Fenrir, the wolf, they tried to bind. At first, they let him live in Asgard. They fed him, watched him, tried to gauge the threat. Only Tyr, god of courage and justice, was brave enough to approach the growing wolf directly. The beast ate enormous amounts. His size increased daily. His strength was already formidable, and the prophecies suggested it would become matchless. The gods decided to bind him, to render him helpless, but they could not do so openly. Fenrir would resist, so they framed it as a game, a test of strength. They brought out chains, thick and heavy, and challenged the wolf to break free. Fenrir accepted, amused perhaps, or curious about his own power. He broke the first chain easily. They brought a stronger one, forged specially by dwarven smiths. Fenrir broke that too, with hardly more effort. The gods were running out of options, so they turned to the finest craftsmen in all the realms, the dwarves of Svartalfheim. They commissioned a binding beyond normal materials, a fetter made from impossible things. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. These were things that did not exist. Yet the dwarves wove them into Gleipnir, a ribbon that appeared thin and silken but could not be broken by any force in the 9 realms. When they brought Gleipnir to Fenrir, the wolf was suspicious. This ribbon looked too delicate, too much like a trick. The gods insisted it was merely another test. Fenrir demanded insurance. If this was genuine, if they meant no treachery, then one of them must place their hand in his mouth while he attempted to break free. If he could not break the ribbon and they refused to release him, he would at least have that hand as compensation. The gods looked at each other. None volunteered. The silence stretched. And then Tyr, brave, honest Tyr, the god of justice itself, stepped forward and placed his right hand between Fenrir's jaws. They bound the wolf with Gleipnir. Fenrir strained against it. The ribbon held. He pulled harder. It did not stretch or weaken. Realization dawned. This was betrayal. The gods had lied. They had no intention of releasing him. And Tyr's hand was still in his mouth. Fenrir bit down. Tyr's hand was severed at the wrist. The god of justice lost his sword hand because his companions broke their word to a wolf. The price of binding Fenrir was their own honor. They fastened the ribbon to a chain, the chain to a boulder, the boulder deep in the earth. They placed a sword in the wolf's mouth, point upward against his upper jaw, hilt against his lower, to keep his jaws open. Saliva poured from his mouth, becoming a river called Hope. And there Fenrir remained, bound but conscious, aware, growing ever more powerful against restraints that could hold him only until Ragnarok. Examine these decisions. The gods faced 3 potential threats, and their response to each one created the very enemies the prophecy foretold. Jormungandr, given the ocean, became unstoppable. Hel, given the dead, became commander of infinite resources. Fenrir, betrayed and bound, became motivation incarnate, a being whose every moment of imprisonment built fury toward his captors. But the greatest strategic failure was moral. By breaking their oath to Fenrir, the gods surrendered the ethical high ground. They could no longer claim to represent justice, law, order against chaos. They had proven themselves oath-breakers when it suited their purposes. They had demonstrated that their word meant nothing when fear dictated otherwise. This matters because in the Norse worldview, honor was currency, reputation was power. A society built on oaths and bonds required those commitments to mean something. When the gods themselves violated this principle, they weakened the entire structure of cosmic order. They created precedent that promises could be broken, that treachery was acceptable when survival seemed at stake. And Loki watched all of this, watched his children torn from him and scattered, watched them transformed from potential threats into active enemies, watched the gods reveal themselves as hypocrites willing to victimize the young and helpless. Whatever loyalty Loki felt toward Asgard, and the sources suggest it, was always ambivalent, at best curdled further. His children had been targeted for crimes they had not yet committed. He had been powerless to stop it. The gods had shown him exactly how much his blood brotherhood with Odin meant when it conflicted with their security. For a time, things continued as before. Loki still attended feasts, still accompanied Thor on adventures, still made himself useful. But the resentment built, the desire for revenge grew, and Loki was nothing if not patient when it suited him. The gods had other concerns. They had bound the greatest physical threat. They had exiled the others. They had, in their view, handled the problem. They returned to their governance, their wars with giants, their accumulation of warriors in Valhalla for the final battle. They assumed the threat was contained. This is a pattern worth noting, because humans repeat it constantly. A problem is addressed with a solution that appears to work in the short term. The immediate crisis passes, attention moves elsewhere, and the underlying issue continues to develop, unseen, until it erupts with greater force than the original threat would have posed. The gods did not kill Loki's children. Perhaps they could not. Prophecy suggested these beings were essential to the cosmic narrative, and killing them might have paradoxically brought Ragnarok sooner. Perhaps they flinched from murdering children for potential future crimes. Perhaps they thought themselves merciful, choosing imprisonment and exile over execution. But they created a situation where three powerful beings had every reason to hate them, centuries or millennia to nurse that hatred, and guaranteed roles in the destruction of Asgard. They turned possibility into certainty, and Loki himself remained, still blood brother to Odin, still protected by oaths that could not be broken without cosmic consequence, still clever, still shape-shifting, still capable of causing damage in ways the more straightforward gods struggled to anticipate or prevent. The sources tell us of Loki's growing malice, how he cut Sif's hair out of spite, how he caused the death of Otra and forced the gods to pay Wergild to Hreidmar, how he increasingly sided with giants in disputes, how his help came with greater and greater cost attached. The gods tolerated this. They had to the blood oath bound them. But more than that, they seemed incapable of recognizing what Loki represented. Not just an individual trickster, but a fundamental flaw in their system, an internal threat that all their military might and strategic positioning could not address. A vulnerability at the heart of their power structure. In our own world, we see this pattern in organizations that cannot remove toxic individuals due to legal protections, personal relationships, or institutional complexity. The damage accumulates. Everyone knows there is a problem. No one has the authority or will to solve it definitively. And eventually, the cost becomes catastrophic. For Loki was planning something that would shake Asgard to its foundations, an act of malice so profound that even the gods, accustomed to his mischief, would be forced to respond. An act that would target the most beloved, the most innocent, the most universally cherished of all the Aesir. He was going to kill Balder, the shining god, the best of them all, and in doing so, he would set in motion the chain of events that would lead inexorably to the doom of everything the gods had built. The wars they had won, the peace they had forged, the power they had consolidated, all of it would unravel because they had failed to properly address one treacherous shapeshifter. Sometimes the greatest threats do not come from the strongest enemy or the largest army. Sometimes they come from the one you trusted, the one who sat beside you at the feast table, the one whose oaths you believed, even after he had given you every reason not to. The gods had made many strategic errors, but none would prove more costly than their mismanagement of Loki and his children, and the price would be paid not just by them, but by every living being in all the 9 realms. There is something profoundly human about trying to change fate, about knowing the future holds disaster yet refusing to accept it as inevitable. We see it in individuals diagnosed with terminal illness who pursue every treatment, every alternative, every possibility. We see it in civilizations building defenses against predicted catastrophes, seawalls against rising oceans, bunkers against nuclear war, vaccines against pandemic. The gods of Asgard faced something even more absolute than these mortal challenges. They did not merely suspect their doom, they knew it. The prophecy of Ragnarok had been spoken by the Volva, the seeress whose sight penetrated the fabric of time itself. The doom of the gods was written into the structure of existence, and yet they prepared, they gathered intelligence, they built armies, they searched desperately for a way to alter what seemed unalterable. Their efforts reveal something remarkable about the Norse understanding of fate and free will. This was not passive acceptance. This was active resistance against the inevitable, even when resistance appeared futile. Let us begin with Odin, for the All-Father's quest for knowledge dominated much of this preparation period. Odin already possessed tremendous wisdom. He had drunk from Mimir's well, sacrificing his eye for the privilege. But knowledge of Ragnarok's coming tormented him. He needed to understand the details, the mechanisms, the sequence of events. Perhaps, he reasoned, if he knew enough, if he understood deeply enough, he could find the weak point in fate's weaving, the place where intervention might succeed. So he undertook the ordeal that would define him. He hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, given to himself as sacrifice to himself. No food, no water, suffering beyond measure. And in that extremity, in that space between life and death, he discovered the runes. These were not merely letters or symbols. Runes were fundamental forces, patterns woven into reality itself. Each rune represented power, knowledge, protection, victory, healing, binding. By understanding the runes, Odin gained ability to influence the world in ways that transcended normal divine authority. He could carve runes on weapons to make them unbreakable, on warriors to grant them courage, on ships to ensure safe passage. This was information warfare on a cosmic scale. Odin was gathering tools, expanding his operational capabilities, preparing for a battle where every advantage would matter. But he did not stop there. Odin traveled in disguise throughout the realms, testing heroes, gathering intelligence, consulting with anyone who might possess knowledge he lacked. He visited Hel's realm to question a dead Volva about the future. He consulted Mimir's preserved head before making crucial decisions. He sent his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory flying across the 9 realms each day to bring him news of everything that transpired. He became, in essence, an intelligence apparatus incarnate, the all-seeing, all-knowing, constantly gathering data, constantly analyzing, constantly seeking the pattern that would allow him to break prophecy's hold. Yet for all this knowledge, a terrible truth emerged. He could not find a way to prevent Ragnarok, only to prepare for it. So preparation became the focus. If the final battle was inevitable, the gods would face it with every possible advantage, with the largest army, with the best equipment, with heroic allies willing to stand beside them when the sky split and the world burned. This is where Valhalla becomes central to the cosmic strategy. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was Odin's great hall in Asgard, a structure so vast it had 540 doors, each wide enough that 800 warriors could march through side by side. Its rafters were made of spears, its roof of shields, and within those halls the greatest warriors from Midgard gathered after death in battle. These were the Einherjar, the chosen slain. When a warrior died with courage, fighting to the last breath, Odin's Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, would descend to the battlefield. They would select the bravest, the most skilled, the most valuable fighters, and bring their souls to Valhalla. There these warriors would feast on boar meat that replenished itself daily, drink mead that never ran dry, and fight each other in the courtyard every day for practice. This was military recruitment as afterlife incentive. The promise of eternal feasting and fighting motivated warriors in Midgard to seek glory in battle, to choose death, fighting over survival through cowardice. It transformed mortality from tragedy into opportunity, a chance to join the god's own army, to matter in the cosmic struggle. Every day, the Einherjar would practice warfare. They would fight until they were hacked to pieces, then rise whole at the feast that night, ready to do it again the next day. They were becoming the most experienced, most practiced fighting force imaginable, an army drilling constantly, accumulating combat experience across centuries, waiting for the day Heimdall's horn would summon them to Ragnarok. Odin was building military strength through time. Each generation of humans provided recruits. Each century of peace meant more warriors in Valhalla's halls. By the time Ragnarok came, he would command not hundreds but thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of the finest fighters humanity had ever produced. This was sound strategic thinking. If you know a great battle is coming, you gather allies, you train relentlessly, you accumulate force until you can field an army worthy of the challenge. But notice the limitation. Odin was preparing for the kind of battle he understood: martial combat, shield walls and sword strokes, the clash of armies in open field. He was preparing to fight Ragnarok as if it were simply a larger version of the conflicts he had already won. He did not, perhaps could not prepare for what Ragnarok actually represented: systemic collapse, the breaking of fundamental rules, the simultaneous failure of every defensive measure at once. Heimdall, guardian of Bifrost, represented the early warning system. His station at the Rainbow Bridge made him the first line of defense and the sentinel who would sound the alarm when enemies approached. The gods gave him Gjallarhorn, a horn whose blast could be heard in all 9 realms. When Heimdall blew that horn, every god would know. The end had come. Heimdall's senses were legendary. He could hear grass growing in Midgard, wool expanding on sheep's backs. He required less sleep than a bird. He could see for hundreds of miles in daylight or darkness. He was the perfect watchman, incorruptible and utterly dedicated to his duty. This made strategic sense. Establish a perimeter guard with supernatural abilities, ensure he can raise the alarm instantly, and you eliminate the possibility of surprise attack. The gods might not be able to prevent Ragnarok, but at least they would see it coming. Yet here again, we see preparation for a conventional threat. Heimdall was positioned to watch for external enemies approaching Asgard. He could sound warning when giants or monsters marched toward Bifrost. But what happens when the bridge itself is destroyed? What happens when attacks come from multiple directions simultaneously? What happens when the Watcher himself becomes a combatant? The gods also sought to protect Balder, the best and brightest among them. His mother, Frigg, Odin's wife, experienced prophetic dreams showing her son's death. Desperate to prevent this, she travelled throughout the 9 realms, making every substance, every object, every creature swear an oath not to harm Balder. Fire promised not to burn him. Water vowed not to drown him. Iron would not cut him. Stone would not crush him. Every plant, every animal, every disease all swore they would not bring Balder harm. When this was complete, the gods discovered that Balder had become essentially invulnerable. They turned this into entertainment, a game. They would throw objects at Balder, shoot arrows at him, strike him with weapons. Nothing could hurt him. He would laugh as axes bounced off, as swords failed to cut. It became a celebration of their success, proof that fate could be cheated if you were thorough enough. But Frigg had missed something. One small plant mistletoe seemed too young, too insignificant to bother. She did not ask it for an oath, and Loki discovered this oversight. The binding of Fenrir, the banishment of Loki's other children, the accumulation of slights and betrayals, all of this had festered in the trickster's heart. Now he saw opportunity for revenge that would strike the gods where they were most vulnerable, not in their bodies, but in their hearts. Loki fashioned a dart from mistletoe. He gave it to Hertha, Balder's blind brother, who sat aside during the games, unable to participate. Loki offered to help him join the fun, to guide his throw. Hertha, innocent and trusting, accepted. The dart flew true. It struck Balder, and the shining god, the most beloved of all the Aesir, fell dead. The silence that followed must have been absolute. The impossible had occurred. The protected had been killed. The best among them was gone, and worse, killed by his own brother's hand, however unwittingly. This was Loki's ultimate power play. He had proven that no protection was perfect, that oaths and preparations could be circumvented by simple cleverness and willingness to exploit tiny oversights. He had taken the god's greatest achievement, making Balder invulnerable, and turned it into the mechanism of his death. The gods tried to retrieve Balder from Hel. They sent Hermod riding Sleipnir down to the underworld to negotiate. Hel offered terms. If everything in the 9 realms would weep for Balder, she would release him. The gods sent messengers throughout all the worlds. Everything wept, gods and humans, animals and plants. Even stones wept for Balder's loss. Everything except one giantess encountered in a cave. She refused to weep. She said, "Let Hel keep what was hers." And that giantess was Loki in disguise. So Balder remained dead. The best of the gods stayed in Hel's realm, and the prophecy advanced one step closer to fulfillment. The gods finally acted against Loki. They hunted him down. He fled, shape-shifting, hiding. They found him eventually, and their punishment was severe. They bound him deep in a cave with the entrails of his own son Nafi, transformed into unbreakable bonds. They placed a serpent above him, positioned so its venom would drip onto his face. His wife Sigyn remained beside him, holding a bowl to catch the venom. But when the bowl filled and she had to empty it, drops would fall on Loki, causing him such agony that his thrashing created earthquakes in Midgard. The gods had finally neutralized Loki. But notice, they did not kill him, they imprisoned him, just as they had imprisoned Fenrir. They created yet another being with absolute motivation for revenge, bound in torment, waiting for the day he could break free. This was the pattern repeating. The gods kept choosing imprisonment over execution, containment over elimination. Perhaps they could not bring themselves to kill one bound by oath to Odin. Perhaps they believed imprisonment was sufficient. Perhaps they thought they were being merciful. But they were simply ensuring that when Ragnarok came, they would face not only external enemies, but internal ones, beings they had personally wronged, who nursed centuries of justified rage, who would lead armies against them, with intimate knowledge of every weakness in Asgard's defences. All the preparation, all the intelligence gathering, all the military build-up, it addressed the wrong problems. Odin accumulated knowledge, but could not find wisdom to prevent the doom. He gathered warriors but faced enemies that transcended conventional warfare. He fortified defenses that would be simultaneously breached from multiple directions. The gods made a fundamental error. They prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. They assumed Ragnarok would be a battle they could win through superior force and better strategy. They did not understand that it represented something more total, the breaking of every system they had established, the failure of every protection simultaneously, the convergence of every threat they had tried to neutralize. This is a trap civilizations fall into repeatedly. We prepare for the disasters we can imagine, that resemble threats we have already faced. We build walls against the invaders we know about, develop vaccines for the diseases we have encountered, construct financial systems to prevent the last economic crisis. And then something unprecedented occurs, something that attacks multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously, something that turns our preparations into liabilities, our strengths into weaknesses, our certainties into confusion. The gods knew Ragnarok was coming. They could see it approaching like a storm on the horizon. But knowing and understanding are different things. They knew the prophecy. They did not understand that the prophecy described not a battle to be won, but a transformation to be endured, the end of one cosmic age and the beginning of another. So they prepared with courage and determination. They did everything within their power. And it would not be enough. Because sometimes fate is not a dragon to be slain or an enemy to be outwitted. Sometimes fate is simply what comes next, inevitable as sunrise, inexorable as the turning of seasons. And the only choice remaining is not whether to face it, but how. The gods chose to face it with honor, to gather their armies, sharpen their weapons, and stand together when the final battle came. To fight not because they could win, but because fighting was what gods did. Because reputation mattered. Because even in defeat there could be glory. Heimdall stood at his post. The Einherjar feasted in Valhalla. Odin consulted Mimir's head. The weapons were ready. The alliances were forged. The preparations were complete. All that remained was the waiting. And the knowledge that when Heimdall's horn finally sounded, when the end began, there would be no strategy clever enough, no force strong enough, no knowledge deep enough to prevent what must occur. The doom was coming, and the gods would meet it as gods should, with weapons drawn and courage unbroken, facing the twilight of their age. There are moments in history when everything changes at once, when the structures that seemed eternal reveal themselves as temporary, when the powerful discover that all their strength means nothing against the convergence of catastrophe. These are not gradual declines, but sudden collapses, the avalanche, the earthquake, the flood that sweeps away everything built across centuries. Ragnarok was such a moment, not a battle in the conventional sense, but the simultaneous failure of every system, every defense, every hope the gods had constructed. And it began, as the prophecy foretold, with breaking bonds and rising waters. The first sign came from deep in the earth, from the cave where Loki had been bound. For centuries, or perhaps millennia, time grows uncertain in these accounts. He had lain in torment, serpent venom dripping onto his face, while his faithful wife Sigyn caught what she could in her bowl. Every time she had to empty the bowl, venom would fall, and Loki's agonized thrashing would shake the foundations of the world, creating what humans in Midgard knew as earthquakes. But the bonds that held him, made from his own son's entrails and transformed by divine magic, were not eternal. Nothing was eternal. Not even the gods themselves, as they would soon discover. Loki broke free. Imagine the moment, the bonds that had held him snapping like dried grass, the serpent recoiling, Loki rising, transformed by centuries of torment into something more focused, more purposeful, more absolutely committed to the destruction of everything the gods had built. He had lost his children to their paranoia. He had lost Balder to his own cunning and their retaliation. Now he would ensure they lost everything. He went to Jotunheim, to the frost giants who had always hated the Aesir. He went to Muspelheim, to the fire giant Surtur, who waited with his flaming sword for the day of destruction. He gathered allies, formed alliances, built the coalition that would assault Asgard from every direction simultaneously. This was strategic coordination on an apocalyptic scale, the unified attack the gods had never quite managed to face before. But Loki was not the only thing breaking free. In the ocean surrounding Midgard, Jormungandr stirred. The world serpent, thrown into the deep by Thor so long ago, had grown until he encircled the entire world, grasping his own tail in his jaws. Now he released that tail. The serpent began to move, to rise from the depths, and his thrashing caused the seas to surge, to rise in great waves that would drown coastlines and sweep away everything built near water. Consider what this meant. The gods had thought they neutralized this threat by casting the serpent away. Instead, they had allowed it to grow beyond any possibility of easy defeat. The ocean that had seemed like a prison was actually incubation space, and now the thing they had tried to forget was coming for them, large enough to be visible from any shore, a living tsunami. And in the forests and wild places, Fenrir broke his bonds. Gleipnir, that ribbon forged from impossible things, that binding that had held the wolf for so long it snapped. The sword lodged between Fenrir's jaws fell away. The wolf's mouth opened so wide his upper jaw touched the sky and his lower jaw scraped the earth. Saliva poured from his jaws like rivers. Fire blazed from his eyes. The wolf was free. The wolf was coming, and he had not forgotten who had bound him, who had betrayed him, who had taken Tyr's hand in his teeth when the gods proved themselves oath-breakers. 3 catastrophes, simultaneous, 3 beings the gods had tried to neutralize, all breaking free at once. This was not coincidence. This was prophecy fulfilling itself. This was the doom that had been written into the structure of time, playing out exactly as the Volva had foreseen. In Asgard, Heimdall stood at his post on the Bifrost. His extraordinary senses, capable of hearing grass grow now, detected something far more terrible. He heard the breaking of bonds in 3 locations. He heard the rising of the serpent and the howling of the wolf. He heard armies gathering in Jotunheim, heard the fire of Muspelheim roaring as Surtur led his forces toward the final battle. Heimdall raised Gjallarhorn to his lips and blew. The sound rang out across all 9 realms. In Valhalla, the Einherjar stopped their eternal fighting and reached for their weapons, knowing the day they had trained for across centuries had finally arrived. In Asgard, the gods gathered, donning armor, taking up the weapons that had served them through countless battles. Odin consulted Mimir's head one final time, though what wisdom the preserved skull offered, the sources do not tell us. Perhaps there was no wisdom that could help now. Perhaps Mimir simply confirmed what Odin already knew, that everything they had feared was coming true. Thor gripped Mjolnir, his hammer that had never failed him. Tyr took up his sword, fighting now with his left hand, his right having been forfeit to Fenrir's jaws. Freyr armed himself, though he had long ago given away his magical sword for love of the giantess Gerd, a choice that seemed romantic in peacetime but tragic in war. The Aesir and the Vanir, those god clans who had once fought each other, now stood together against the enemies gathering at their gates. The forces of destruction approached from multiple directions. This was the strategic nightmare the gods had never quite prepared for. Not a single army to face in the field, but coordinated assaults that would fracture their defenses. From Jotunheim came the frost giants, ancient enemies, now led by Loki himself. The giant who had been blood brother to Odin now commanded the forces that would destroy Odin's realm. This was betrayal made manifest, turned into military command. From Muspelheim came Surtur and the fire giants, beings of elemental flame whose very presence burned. Surtur wielded a sword of fire, a blade that shone brighter than the sun itself. These were forces of primal destruction, chaos incarnate, the opposite of everything the gods represented. From the sea came the ship Naglfar, built from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, piloted by giants and carrying armies of the damned. And beside it, rising from the depths, came Jormungandr, the world serpent, moving toward the shore where he would confront his ancient enemy. From the underworld came Hel's contribution legions of the dead, those who had died of sickness and age, now formed into an army under their queen's command. The gods had given her dominion over death, and she had used it to build a force that outnumbered the Einherjar many times over. And Fenrir came, the great wolf, running across the land with his massive jaws open, consuming everything in his path, heading straight for Odin himself. The gods marched out to meet them. The Einherjar poured forth from Valhalla hundreds, thousands of the finest warriors humanity had produced, eager for the battle they had been promised. This was their moment, the purpose for which they had been chosen. They formed ranks, locked shields, and prepared to die truly and finally, in service to the gods who had honored them. The two forces met at the field called Vigrid, a plain that stretched 100 leagues in every direction. This was space for armies beyond counting, room for the final confrontation between order and chaos, between the divine civilization and the forces that would unmake it. And then the battle began. Thor strode forward to face Jormungandr. These two had been destined for this confrontation since the day Thor threw the serpent into the ocean. They had met once before, when Thor tried to lift what he thought was a cat but was actually the serpent in disguise, and nearly broke the world by lifting it. Now they faced each other without illusion or trick, god and monster, hammer and venom, ancient enemies meeting for the final time. Thor swung Mjolnir with all his legendary strength. The hammer struck the serpent's skull with a sound like thunder splitting mountains. Jormungandr's head shattered. The world serpent collapsed, dead before it struck the ground. Thor had won. The monster was slain. The god's mightiest warrior had triumphed once again. But the serpent's venom, spraying from its broken head, had drenched Thor. The poison was beyond anything even a god could survive. Thor staggered backward. He took 9 steps away from the corpse of his greatest enemy, and then he fell, dead. This was Pyrrhic victory incarnate. The threat eliminated, but only at the cost of the champion, the strongest of the gods dying in the moment of triumph. Success and catastrophe merged into a single event. Odin confronted Fenrir. The All-Father, the god who had sought wisdom in every corner of the cosmos, who had sacrificed so much for knowledge and power, now faced the wolf he had ordered bound. The wolf whose binding had required oath-breaking and betrayal. All of Odin's preparations, all his intelligence gathering, all his Einherjar warriors, none of it mattered against the sheer force of Fenrir's rage. The wolf's jaws closed around Odin. The All-Father disappeared into that darkness. The leader of the gods, the architect of cosmic order, the one who had killed Ymir and created the worlds gone, consumed, erased, the command structure collapsed. When you build everything around a central figure, his death creates chaos that ripples through every level of organization. The Einherjar fought on, but their purpose to defend Odin had been eliminated. The carefully prepared strategy dissolved into individual combats, moments of heroism without coordination. Vidar, Odin's son, witnessed his father's death. He ran toward Fenrir, and in some accounts he placed his foot wearing a boot made from all the leather scraps accumulated since the beginning of time in the wolf's lower jaw. He grabbed the upper jaw with his hands and tore the wolf apart, ripping Fenrir's mouth wide until the beast died. Vengeance for Odin. But vengeance changes nothing when the whole world is burning. Tyr faced Garm, the monstrous hound who had guarded Hell's gates. The two killed each other in mutual destruction, the one-handed god and the hellhound falling together, neither victorious. Heimdall and Loki found each other on the battlefield, the watchman who had sounded the alarm and the trickster who had orchestrated the doom. They had opposed each other through ages, represented opposite principles, vigilance versus deception, duty versus chaos. Now they fought their final battle, and it ended as so many did that day, both dying, both achieving nothing except their mutual destruction. Freya, who had given away his magical sword for love, fought Surtur with inferior weapons, the god of fertility and sunlight facing the giant of primordial fire. It was no contest. Surtur's flaming sword cut Freya down. The god who had brought prosperity and peace to the realms fell before elemental destruction. And then Surtur did what he had waited since, the beginning of time, to do. He raised his flaming sword and set fire to everything, not just the battlefield, not just Asgard, everything. The 9 realms burned. Yggdrasil itself, the world tree that connected all existence, caught fire. Its roots, tended so carefully by the Norns, blazed. Its branches, which held the realms like fruits, burned. The squirrel Ratatosk died in the flames. The stags that ate its leaves burned. The dragon Nidhogg, who had gnawed at its roots for so long, was consumed. The Bifrost Bridge shattered that rainbow connection between Asgard and other realms. That defensive choke point, that symbol of divine authority, broke apart and fell into the void. The halls of Asgard burned. Valhalla, where the Einherjar had feasted, collapsed. Odin's throne room filled with fire. The golden halls where gods had counselled and celebrated for ages turned to ash and molten metal. Midgard drowned and burned simultaneously. The rising seas from Jormungandr's thrashing swept inland, drowning cities and farmlands. Surtur's fires consumed everything the water did not reach. Humanity, those beings the gods had created, who had worshipped and sacrificed and sent their warriors to Valhalla, died by the thousands, by the millions, helpless before cosmic catastrophe. The stars fell from the sky. The sun and moon were swallowed by the wolves that had chased them since the beginning of time. Darkness absolute descended. Fire provided the only light, and it was the light of destruction. This was not defeat in battle. This was annihilation of the battlefield itself. This was reality unmaking, the structures of existence collapsing back toward the primordial void from which they had emerged, order dissolving into chaos, civilization erased. The gods' entire project, everything they had built from Ymir's body, everything they had established and defended and developed, gone. The gods had prepared for a war. They faced the end of the world. They had accumulated, forced to match their enemies. But their enemies did not want conquest, they wanted extinction. There is no strategy against an opponent whose victory condition is total destruction, including their own. The fires burned until there was nothing left to burn. The floods drowned everything that fire had not reached, and then, slowly, the cosmos grew still. The flames died down for lack of fuel. The waters, having consumed all in their path, grew calm. Silence, darkness, the void. Everything the gods had built was gone. Everyone who had fought was dead or dying. The 9 realms were ash and flood-scoured ruins. Yggdrasil was a burned stump. The cosmic order had collapsed. This was Ragnarok, not a battle lost, but a world ended. The twilight of the gods made manifest. The doom that prophecy had promised, delivered in full measure. And yet, in the silence and the darkness, something stirred, something survived. The story was not quite finished. For even in absolute destruction, Even in the ending of everything, life finds a way, and the cosmos, having been unmade, could be made again. Different, changed, but possible. After the fire, after the flood, after everything has ended, what remains? This is not merely a mythological question. It echoes through every civilization that has faced collapse, every ecosystem that has endured catastrophe, every system that has been broken and must somehow reform. The Norse understood something profound, that ending and beginning are not opposites, but phases in a cycle. That destruction clears space for new growth. That from ashes, green shoots eventually emerge. The cosmos lay in ruins. The gods were dead. The realms were burned and drowned. Yggdrasil was a charred remnant. And yet, in the silence that followed the fire, something extraordinary occurred. The world began again, not as it had been. That would be impossible. The old order was gone, its leaders fallen, its structures obliterated. But life, stubborn, persistent, inexhaustible life, found footholds in the ruins and began to rebuild. The sources tell us that the earth rose from the waters. Slowly, gradually, land emerged from the floods that had covered everything. Green and fertile, washed clean by the catastrophe, ready for new beginnings. This was not the same earth that Odin and his brothers had crafted from Ymir's body. This was a world reborn, carrying some memory of what came before, but fundamentally transformed by its passage through destruction. And there were survivors, not many, but enough. Consider what this means. Ragnarok was supposed to be the doom of the gods, the ending of everything, total annihilation. Yet some beings persisted. Some endured when all the mightiest warriors and most powerful magic workers fell. The question becomes, who survived and why? Vidar and Vali, sons of Odin, emerged from the ruins. These were not the most famous gods, not the greatest warriors, not the ones featured in the grandest stories. Vidar had avenged his father by killing Fenrir, then apparently survived the subsequent fires. Vali had been born specifically to avenge Baldur's death, had killed Hertha in his first day of life. They were peripheral figures in the old order, gods with specific purposes but not central to the power structure. Perhaps this was why they survived. They were not primary targets, they had fewer enemies. They operated on the margins rather than at the center where combat was fiercest. Sometimes survival favors not the strongest but the least entangled. Modi and Magni, sons of Thor, also survived. They inherited their father's hammer, Mjolnir, that weapon which had never failed, which had slain countless giants, which had killed the world serpent itself in Thor's final battle. The hammer passed to a new generation. Critical resources, preserved through catastrophe, available for whatever challenges the new age would bring. This represents continuity through succession. Thor was gone, but his strength lived on through his sons. The defensive capability he represented did not disappear entirely. It transferred to those who came after, adapted to new circumstances, ready to face new threats or perhaps to serve different purposes in a changed world. Hertha and Baldur returned from Hel's realm. This is remarkable. Baldur, whose death had been the beginning of the end, whose loss had demonstrated that even the most protected could fall, he came back. And his unwitting killer, the blind god who had thrown the mistletoe dart, returned with him. The tragedy that set Ragnarok in motion was somehow reversed. The victims restored, given another chance. Think about what their return suggests. During Ragnarok, when everything was breaking and burning, Baldur and Hertha were absent. They were in Hel's realm, the land of the dead, removed from the battlefield entirely. By being dead, they avoided the destruction. By being out of play, they survived to return when a new game began. This was passive defense succeeding where active combat failed. The Einherjar fought bravely and died. Odin faced Fenrir and was consumed. Thor killed his enemy and was killed in return. But those who were elsewhere, uninvolved in the final battle, persisted. Sometimes the winning move is not to play. Hoenir, that god the Aesir had sent to the Vanir during the hostage exchange, the one who seemed unable to make decisions without Mimir's counsel, he survived as well. Again, a peripheral figure. Again, someone not central to the command structure that collapsed when Odin fell. He would serve as priest in the new order, reading auguries, maintaining ritual, a different kind of leadership for a different kind of world. And then there were the humans. Two of them, Lif and Lifthrasir, life and life's yearning, emerged from within Yggdrasil itself. While Ragnarok raged, while fire consumed the realms and floods drowned the land, these two had hidden inside the world tree. They had survived on morning dew. They had waited in darkness while everything they knew was destroyed. When they emerged, they found a new earth, empty and waiting. They would become the ancestors of a new human race, just as Ask and Embla had been the first. The cycle would continue. Humanity would build again, tell stories again, worship whatever gods existed in this changed cosmos. Notice their survival strategy. They hid. They did not take up weapons to defend Midgard. They did not try to fight the serpent or the giants or the fires. They found shelter in the most protected place imaginable inside the cosmic tree itself, in the heart of the structure that connected all realms. And they simply endured, patient, passive, surviving by being too small to target, too hidden to find. This was not the heroism the old gods valued. The Einherjar chose glorious combat and died. Lif and Lifthrasir chose concealment and lived. The Norse understood that both approaches had merit, that survival sometimes requires unheroic choices, that hiding can be as strategic as fighting. The surviving gods gathered. The sources tell us they met in the place where Asgard had stood, though Asgard itself was gone. They discussed the past, remembered the fallen, shared knowledge of what had been. They found the golden game pieces, taffel pieces, perhaps that the Aesir had once used for play. These objects, somehow surviving when gods and halls had not, represented continuity. Small things preserving memory when grand structures failed. And they made a crucial decision. They would not repeat the mistakes of the past. The new divine order appeared fundamentally different from what came before. The sources describe them gathering peacefully, discussing rather than commanding. There was no mention of Valhalla rebuilt, no armies being accumulated, no preparation for future warfare. The hierarchical, martial culture that had dominated Asgard seemed absent or at least diminished. This was learning from catastrophe. The old gods had prepared constantly for battle, had valued military strength above all else, had created a civilization organized around warfare and glory in combat, and it had led to total destruction. The new gods, whether by choice or necessity, seemed to embrace different values. They appeared less aggressive, less expansionist, more focused on maintaining what they had rather than conquering more, defensive rather than offensive, consolidation rather than ambition. This represented a fundamental strategic shift from martial glory towards sustainable stability. But questions remained. Would this gentler approach prove sufficient? The cosmos still contained giants. The sources do not tell us that all of them died in Ragnarok. Threats would eventually emerge. Conflicts would arise. How would a less martial pantheon respond? Perhaps they had learned that overwhelming force creates overwhelming opposition, that binding enemies makes them more dangerous, that trying to prevent fate through violence only ensures fate arrives as prophesied. Perhaps they would try diplomacy first, negotiation, the kind of peace treaty that had ended the Aesir-Vanir war and created the strongest version of the old divine order. Or perhaps the cycle would simply repeat. New gods would grow in power, would face new threats, would make similar mistakes, would fall in their own version of Ragnarok. The Norse conception of time was cyclical, not linear. Endings led to beginnings, which led eventually to endings again. The great wheel turned, and every civilization rode it through growth and glory and decline and destruction and rebirth. Yggdrasil itself survived, though damaged. The world tree that connected all realms had burned, but its roots remained alive. From those roots, new growth would come. The infrastructure that held the cosmos together could be rebuilt. The connections between realms could be re-established. The system would function again, though perhaps differently. This is the nature of resilient systems. They can suffer catastrophic damage and still regenerate, because the fundamental structure persists. You can burn a forest to the ground, but if the soil remains and seeds survive, forest returns. You can destroy a civilization's cities and kill its leaders, but if the knowledge persists and people survive, civilization rebuilds. The Norse understood this. Their myths were not about permanent victory or eternal empires. They were about endurance through cycles, about rebirth after destruction, about the persistence of patterns even when specific forms change. The sun and moon return to the sky, though the sources differ on details. Some say the sun had given birth to a daughter before being swallowed, and this daughter now rode her mother's path. The darkness that had fallen during Ragnarok lifted. Light returned. Time could be measured again. The daily cycle that regulated agriculture and navigation and ordinary life resumed. Without the sun, nothing grows. Without the moon, tides do not turn. The restoration of these celestial bodies meant that life could continue in forms familiar to humans, that farmers could plant in expectation of harvest, that sailors could navigate, that the basic conditions for human civilization existed once more. The new earth was described as more fertile, more beautiful than the old. Whether this was literal truth or metaphor, the way catastrophe can make what comes after seem more precious by comparison matters less than the message. That destruction is not necessarily permanent loss, that systems can emerge from crisis, improved rather than diminished. This was not naive optimism. The Norse were not a people who believed in easy, happy endings. They knew life was hard, that winters were cruel, that enemies were real, that death came for everyone. But they also knew that spring followed winter, that wounds could heal, that children carried forward what parents began. The survival of certain gods and the return of others created a pantheon with interesting characteristics. They had combat capability through Modi and Magni with Mjolnir. They had leadership in Vidar and Vali. They had the returned wisdom and innocence of Balder and Hertha. They had ritual knowledge in Hoenir. This was not the same balance of powers the old order possessed, but it was sufficient to begin again, and humanity would provide what humanity had always provided: worship, stories, meaning-making. Lif and Lithrasir would have children, and those children would build communities, and those communities would need explanations for why the sun moved and where thunder came from, and what happened after death. The gods would serve these functions again, would be woven into the fabric of human understanding. But there would be differences. The new humans had no memory of the old world, no stories of the Aesir's glory days, no tradition of sending warriors to Valhalla. They would develop their own relationship with the surviving gods, create their own myths to explain the world they inhabited. The cultural traditions that had sustained the old order would have to be rebuilt from new foundations. This is what makes the post-Ragnarok world so fascinating. It was not a simple return to the status quo. It was genuinely new, same fundamental forces operating in cosmos and nature, but organized differently, guided by different priorities, building toward an uncertain future rather than recapitulating a known past. The strategic lesson here is profound. Systems that survive catastrophe often do so by being less rigid than what came before, by learning from failure, by diversifying rather than concentrating power, by valuing resilience over dominance. The old gods had concentrated power in Asgard, in Odin's leadership, in military might. When those structures fell, everything collapsed. The new order, such as it was, seemed more distributed, less dependent on any single leader or location. Whether this made it stronger or weaker would only become clear with time. Time to test whether the new gods could handle threats when they emerged. Time to see if humans would develop the same warrior culture or something different. Time to discover if the cycle would indeed repeat or if something genuinely new had been born. The sources end here, leaving the future unwritten. The Norse who told these stories did not claim to know what would happen next. They had explained the past, described the catastrophe, shown the possibility of renewal, but prophecy had been fulfilled. The future beyond Ragnarok was not predetermined, it was open, awaiting the choices of gods and humans yet to come. This uncertainty itself carries meaning. The message that fate ruled everything, that Ragnarok was inevitable, that the gods themselves could not escape their doom. This was balanced by the revelation that beyond doom lay possibility, that endings create space for new beginnings, that life persists, that the story continues even after the story seems to end. For Lif and Lithrasir, emerging into sunlight after hiding in darkness. For Modi and Magni, lifting their father's hammer. For Balder, walking the green earth again. For all of them, the question was the same. What will you build in the world after the world ends? The Norse left that question unanswered. Perhaps because they knew their own world was ending, their own gods fading as Christianity spread through Scandinavia. Perhaps because they understood that each generation must answer that question for themselves. What remains after catastrophe? What survives when everything seems lost? How do we rebuild when the old order has fallen? These are not just mythological questions. They are the questions every civilization faces when its certainties collapse. And the Norse answer was neither naive hope nor bitter despair, but something more nuanced, the recognition that destruction and creation are phases in an eternal cycle, that survival requires adaptation, and that life, persistent, ingenious, stubborn life, finds ways to continue. There is a fascinating moment in the life of any story when it stops being simply entertainment and becomes something more, a tool, a resource to be deployed for specific purposes, a cultural asset that can be claimed, interpreted, shaped to serve the needs of those who tell it. The Norse myths were never just stories about gods and giants. They were instruments of power, identity markers, political capital used by real people, facing real challenges across more than 1,000 years of human history. Let us step back from the realm of gods and examine the humans who believed in them, told stories about them, and eventually wrote those stories down. What were they trying to accomplish? How did these myths serve their needs? And what does it tell us about the relationship between story and society, between mythology and meaning-making? The Viking Age, roughly 750 to 1100 AD, was the period when these myths thrived in oral tradition throughout Scandinavia. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the settlements Vikings established across the North Atlantic, Iceland, Greenland, and briefly even North America. These were seafaring peoples, raiders and traders, farmers and explorers, living in harsh climates where survival required cooperation and courage in equal measure. For these people, the myths served multiple strategic functions simultaneously. First and most obviously, political legitimacy. Kings throughout Scandinavia claimed descent from Odin himself. This was not metaphor. They traced specific lineages, constructed genealogies that connected their family lines directly to the Allfather. When a king could claim divine ancestry, his authority transcended mere human politics. He ruled not just by force or popular support, but by blood right inherited from the gods themselves. This is political capital of the highest order. Imagine the power of standing before your people and saying, "I am not merely your leader. I am descended from Odin, who created the world, who commands wisdom and victory, who sits in Valhalla gathering heroes for the final battle." Opposition to such a king becomes not just political dissent, but cosmic impiety. Rebellion against him is rebellion against the divine order. The Jarls and chieftains who competed for power beneath the kings used similar strategies, claiming descent from Thor or other warrior gods. Your lineage became your credentials. Mythology transformed into political documentation. The stories everyone knew about Odin's cunning, Thor's strength, Freya's prosperity, became implicit arguments for why specific families deserved to rule. Second, military morale and recruitment. The concept of Valhalla served a brilliant psychological function. If you died in battle with courage, the Valkyries would carry you to Odin's hall, where you would feast and fight eternally, preparing for Ragnarok. You would sit beside heroes, be served by beautiful maidens, eat meat that replenished itself, and drink mead that never ran dry. But if you died in bed of sickness or old age, you went to Hell's realm, not necessarily a place of torture, but certainly not glorious. The sources describe it as cold, misty, somewhat dreary, adequate for the dead who had lived ordinary lives, but not a destination worth seeking. The strategic implication is obvious. This belief system made young men eager for warfare. Death in battle transformed from tragedy to opportunity. Parents could bear the loss of sons more easily if they believed those sons now feasted in Valhalla. The fallen warrior's reputation elevated his entire family. Communities honored those who died fighting, creating social pressure toward courage and aggression. When a Jarl needed to raise a raiding force or defend against attackers, he had volunteers who genuinely believed death in combat was preferable to peaceful survival. This belief did not just motivate warriors, it shaped entire military cultures. The berserkers, those fighters who worked themselves into battle frenzy, howling and biting their shields, fighting with apparent immunity to pain, they were channeling the divine madness attributed to Odin himself. They were living mythology, making themselves into weapons through belief. Third, social cohesion and shared identity. The myths provided common cultural reference points across communities, separated by vast distances and harsh geography. A farmer in Norway, and a trader in Iceland, and a warrior in Sweden all knew the same stories, honored the same gods, understood the same values. They could meet as strangers and find immediate common ground in shared mythology. The blots, religious festivals held at key points in the agricultural calendar, gathered communities for sacrifice, feasting, and storytelling. These were not just religious observances, they were social infrastructure. The occasions when disputes were settled, alliances formed, marriages arranged, trade agreements negotiated. The gods provided the framework, but humans used that framework to maintain the bonds that held society together. Fourth, the myths explained the world and provided moral guidance. Why does thunder roll across the sky? Thor is driving his chariot, hunting giants. Why do earthquakes occur? Loki is thrashing in his bonds when venom strikes his face. Why must we honor our oaths? Because even the gods suffer when they break their word, as Tyr's lost hand attests. Why must we prepare for inevitable hardship? Because even the gods face Ragnarok, yet they prepare and fight with honor. The concept of word fate or destiny permeated Norse culture. Events were foreordained, woven by the Norns, yet individuals still bore responsibility for facing their fate with courage. This paradox determinism, combined with emphasis on individual honor and choice, shaped how people approached danger, mortality, and ethical decisions. Then, around 800 to 1100 AD, everything began to change. Christianity arrived in Scandinavia, brought by missionaries, foreign wives, traders who had converted abroad, and the Norse peoples faced a strategic calculation that would determine not just their religious identity, but their political and economic futures. Europe was increasingly Christian. The kingdoms that controlled trade routes, the merchants with access to luxury goods, the political alliances that could provide military support, increasingly, these required Christian affiliation. A pagan king struggled to negotiate with Christian monarchs, to arrange marriages that would bring alliances to be taken seriously in diplomatic circles. Some rulers saw conversion as strategic necessity. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark converted around 960 AD and immediately began consolidating power more effectively, building churches alongside his fortifications, using Christian imagery on his monuments, while not entirely abandoning the old symbols. His gelling stone still standing in Denmark shows both Christian crosses and traditional Norse designs. This was transition management, bringing his people along gradually rather than demanding immediate transformation. Other rulers resisted longer, maintaining the old ways, arguing that abandoning the gods who had served their ancestors was both impious and strategically foolish. But resistance meant increasing isolation from European trade networks, fewer allies, reduced access to technology and goods flowing through Christian kingdoms. For ordinary people, conversion often happened even more gradually. They might be baptized, attend church, yet still leave offerings at old, sacred groves. They might celebrate Christian holidays while maintaining traditional festivals. They might pray to Christ on Sunday and to Thor before a sea voyage on Monday. This was not hypocrisy, but pragmatic hedging. Why risk offending any powerful entity when stakes are eternal? The mythology adapted rather than disappeared immediately. Stories that had been about Odin became stories about saints with similar characteristics. Festivals associated with pagan gods were reframed as Christian celebrations occurring at the same time of year. The structure of belief persisted even as the specific details transformed. But the old myths faced a grave threat. They existed primarily in oral tradition. Without writing, without systematic preservation, they depended on skalds, the poets who memorized and recited traditional stories to carry them forward. As Christianity spread, as literacy and Latin became associated with power and prestige, the old oral traditions risked being lost entirely. This is where Iceland becomes crucial to our story. Iceland had been settled by Norse people fleeing conflicts in Scandinavia around 870 AD. Isolated by ocean, developing its own governmental structures, Iceland maintained Norse traditions longer than the Scandinavian mainland, and crucially, Iceland developed a literary culture that chose to preserve the old myths even after converting to Christianity. In the 1200s AD, 200 years after Iceland's official conversion, scholars like Snorri Sturluson wrote down the myths, not as religious texts to be believed, but as cultural heritage to be preserved, as literature worthy of study, as the old stories that had shaped their ancestors' understanding of the cosmos. Snorri's Prose Edda and the earlier Poetic Edda compiled from various sources are why we know these myths today. Without Icelandic Christians choosing to write down pagan stories, the detailed narratives of Odin and Thor and Ragnarok would have been lost, surviving only in fragments, in place names, in distant echoes. This represents a fascinating strategic decision: to preserve what you no longer believe, to recognize that cultural identity transcends current religious affiliation, that maintaining connection to ancestral traditions matters even when those traditions are no longer literally true. Iceland created literary capital from mythology, developing a unique cultural product that distinguished them within the Christian European world. The myths served yet another purpose in Iceland. They provided plots and characters for saga literature, those prose narratives about feuding families and heroic individuals that became Iceland's major artistic contribution to medieval culture. The same narrative skills honed over generations telling stories about gods now applied to tales of human drama, but informed by the mythological framework, sharing similar themes of honor and fate and inevitable doom. For centuries after conversion, the myths existed in this liminal space, no longer believed as literal truth, but still culturally significant, still taught and studied, still shaping how people understood their heritage. They were history and literature and identity marker, no longer religious doctrine. Then, beginning in the 1800s and accelerating through the 1900s and into our own time, the Norse myths experienced multiple waves of revival and reappropriation, each serving different purposes for different groups. Nationalist movements across Scandinavia and Germany claimed Norse mythology as proof of Northern European cultural superiority. This was distortion in service of ideology, taking stories about gods and fate and honor, stripping away their complexity, using them as symbols of racial identity and martial glory. The appropriation reached its most toxic form in Nazi Germany, where Norse symbols were deployed as propaganda, where mythology was twisted into justification for atrocity. This represents the dark side of cultural capital, that powerful stories can be claimed and weaponized, used to unite in-groups while demonizing others, employed to justify violence through selective interpretation of ancient texts. The Norse peoples who originally told these stories would likely not recognize the ideology constructed from their fragments. Simultaneously, neo-pagan movements have attempted to revive Norse religious practices, creating modern versions of ancient worship. Asatru and heathenry claim to reconstruct pre-Christian belief systems, to honor the old gods in contemporary contexts. For some practitioners, this represents genuine spiritual seeking. For others, it provides community and identity anchored in indigenous European tradition. The challenge these movements face is authenticity. How do you practice a religion whose original form was never written down, whose practices varied by region and time period, and which existed in a cultural context utterly different from modernity? What emerges is necessarily reconstruction and invention as much as preservation, new traditions claiming ancient authority. Popular culture represents yet another form of utilization. Marvel Comics transformed Thor into a superhero, creating a version of the Thunder God that has reached billions through films and merchandise. Fantasy literature from Tolkien onward has borrowed heavily from Norse mythology, dwarves, elves, the World Tree, the final apocalyptic battle. Video games, television series, novels, Norse myths provide endless source material for entertainment products. This commercialization troubles some who value the mythology's historical and cultural significance, but it also ensures the stories survive, that new generations encounter these names and narratives, that the myths remain living rather than museum pieces. A child who watches a Thor movie might eventually read the Prose Edda. Popular culture becomes gateway to deeper engagement. Throughout all these appropriations and revivals, certain themes persist. The emphasis on honor and courage, the acceptance of fate while maintaining individual agency, the recognition that all things end, including civilizations and gods themselves, and yet life continues beyond endings. These core ideas seem to resonate across cultures and centuries, finding purchase in contemporary contexts distant from Viking Age Scandinavia. What does this historical journey teach us? That mythology is never only about what it claims to describe. The Norse myths explained thunder and earthquakes, yes. But more fundamentally, they provided tools for legitimizing authority, motivating warriors, maintaining social cohesion, understanding mortality, and preserving cultural identity through transformation. The same stories served different functions for different audiences: divine genealogy for kings, inspiration for berserkers, common reference for traders, subjects for poets, heritage for Christians, symbols for nationalists, spirituality for neo-pagans, entertainment for global audiences. The myths adapted to serve each context, their meanings multiplying rather than remaining fixed. And perhaps this is appropriate for myths about a cosmos that dies and is reborn, about gods who know their doom and face it anyway, about the cycle that continues beyond apparent ending. These stories have survived their own Ragnarok, the death of the culture that created them, and emerged transformed, still relevant, still providing frameworks for understanding courage and fate and the persistence of life through catastrophe. For ultimately, what humans needed from these myths was not just explanation of natural phenomena or entertainment around the fire. What they needed was meaning, a way to understand why hardship mattered, why courage had value, why honor was worth maintaining even when no one watched, why preparing for inevitable challenges remained worthwhile even when victory was impossible. The Norse gave us myths that said, yes, everything ends. The gods themselves will fall, the world will burn, nothing lasts forever. And yet you prepare, you fight with honor, you maintain your oaths, you face the doom bravely. Not because you can win, but because how you face the inevitable defines who you are. That message, forged in the harsh climate and violent context of Viking Age Scandinavia, continues to resonate wherever humans face challenges that seem insurmountable, wherever people must choose between comfortable surrender and doomed resistance, wherever the question arises, what matters when nothing lasts? The Norse answered, what matters is how you act in the time you have. The glory is not in permanent victory, but in courageous struggle. The meaning is not in endless existence, but in the honor with which you face your ending. And that answer, carried forward through centuries, appropriated and adapted, commercialized and revived, studied and retold, that answer still echoes in the human heart. Wherever someone stands against the darkness and chooses to fight on, even knowing the darkness will eventually win. Not as literal truth, but as reminder that our ancestors faced the void, found meaning despite mortality, and passed forward stories that helped them and might yet help us understand what it means to live well in a world where nothing lasts. The gods died at Ragnarok, but the stories about them persist, and in that persistence there is a kind of immortality after all.